Snow fell softly over Manhattan, painting the city in silver silence. Inside a marble penthouse overlooking Central Park, Edward Blake, one of New York's wealthiest men, watched his reflection in the glass. Cold, distant, untouched by the Christmas lights blinking below. That morning, his daughter Sophia had refused to open the advent calendar he'd ordered from Paris. "It doesn't matter, Dad," she'd whispered. "You're never here to open it with me anyway." Her words sliced through him sharper than winter air. For years, Edward had built empires but neglected the small kingdom that truly mattered, his home. His late wife's laughter no longer echoed through the halls. Now only silence lived there. Even Grace Johnson, the family's black nanny who had cared for Sophia since she was 3, could sense the growing frost between father and daughter. That night, Grace stood by the Christmas tree stringing golden lights. "Sir," she said gently, "sometimes love shows up when pride steps aside." Edward said nothing, but her words followed him long after she left the room. The next morning, in a moment of reckless hope, he did something no billionaire in his right mind would do. He put on an old driver's cap, borrowed a yellow cab, and decided to pick up his own daughter from school, pretending to be someone else. Long before Edward Blake became a name whispered in boardrooms and printed on Forbes covers, he was simply a young man chasing stability. He grew up in a crumbling apartment above his father's failed repair shop, learning early that love couldn't pay the bills. When he met Clara, a literature teacher with eyes that smiled even when her paycheck didn't, he swore he'd give her a life untouched by struggle. For a while, he did. Their laughter filled a modest home, and when Sophia was born on a snowy Christmas Eve, he promised both mother and child that they'd never want for anything again. But success came like a storm, sudden, consuming, and merciless. Meetings replaced dinners, flights replaced lullabies. Clara waited through missed anniversaries until one night, driving alone to bring him a forgotten coat to the airport, her car spun on black ice. The call came while Edward was closing a deal in London. By the time he reached the hospital, Clara was gone, and his newborn daughter was sleeping in the arms of a nurse. He never forgave himself for choosing profit over presence. Instead, he buried grief beneath schedules and screens. To the world, he became Blake the Brilliant. To his daughter, he became the ghost in every photo. Years passed. Sophia grew up surrounded by luxury but starved for attention. It was Grace Johnson, the black nanny with a calm voice and worn hands, who became Sophia's anchor. She read bedtime stories when Edward was on business calls, patched scraped knees, and whispered prayers before sleep. Grace had once lost her own son to a heart condition and had sworn she would never love another child as deeply. But Sophia broke that vow without even trying. Grace saw everything Edward pretended not to notice. The way Sophia's eyes dimmed at every "next time, sweetheart," and how she started drawing herself alone in school projects. Grace tried to bridge the gap, telling Edward gently, "Sir, children don't remember the gifts. They remember the moments you stayed." He nodded, always with a polite smile, but his phone would buzz and the moment would vanish. The first snow of that December came heavy and early. Grace decorated the Blake mansion with holly and pine cones, humming old gospel carols, while Sophia helped string ornaments on the massive 12-foot tree. Edward arrived late that night, briefcase still in hand, pretending not to see the disappointment flicker across his daughter's face. After she went to bed, Grace found him staring at the flickering fireplace. "You're not a bad man, Mr. Blake," she said softly. "You're just afraid of the kind of love that doesn't come with contracts." For once, he didn't argue. The mansion felt too big, too silent, too cold. He thought about Clara's last Christmas, how she'd begged him to skip one meeting, just one, how he'd promised to make it up later. There was no later. That night, Edward walked through the empty nursery still preserved as it had been years ago. The faint smell of baby powder and dust stirred a pain he had long buried. He looked at the photo on the dresser, Clara holding baby Sophia, both smiling into the camera, and realized the woman he'd loved most had never cared about wealth. She had only wanted his time. Now, history was repeating itself. His daughter was drifting the same way Clara once had, quietly, gracefully, out of reach. He sat on the edge of Sophia's bed, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead as she slept. She murmured something in her dream. He leaned closer and heard a whisper that cracked his composure. "Mommy, please make Daddy stay this time." Edward blinked hard, heart tightening. From the doorway, Grace watched silently, her eyes glistening. In that fragile stillness, under the faint glow of the Christmas lights outside, a thought began to form. One reckless, foolish, human thought. Maybe the only way to reach his daughter's heart was to step down from his throne and walk among ordinary people again. The next morning, Christmas lights still blinked faintly in the soft gray dawn. Edward adjusted the old driver's cap in his mirror and took a deep breath. The cab smelled faintly of leather and pine freshener. Grace had noticed the disguise earlier that morning and simply said, "Sometimes, Mr. Blake, the only way to see your child's world is to kneel down to her height." She pressed a small knitted scarf into his hands, red and green, worn but warm. "It was my son's," she said. "It might remind you to drive slow and listen faster." Edward couldn't reply. Words failed where sincerity began. He drove through the frost-glazed streets toward Sophia's school, the city unfolding like a stage set for redemption. Children in colorful coats ran past candy cane decorations. The radio hummed an old Bing Crosby tune, "I'll Be Home for Christmas." The irony bit deep. When the school bell rang, Sophia stepped outside, scanning for the family's black limousine. Instead, she found a battered yellow taxi. The man inside wore a faded coat and an old cap, head tilted low. She hesitated, clutching her backpack. "You need a ride, young lady?" Edward's voice was gravelly, softened to disguise his tone. Sophia nodded politely and climbed into the back seat. The door shut with a soft click that echoed in his chest. For a few blocks, silence ruled. Then he asked, "You got plans for Christmas?" "Not really," she murmured. "Just dinner with Dad and Ms. Grace." Her words carried both affection and absence. Edward swallowed. "You like Miss Grace?" Sophia's eyes lifted to the mirror. "She's nice. She listens. She makes real hot chocolate, not the kind from the machine." A pause. "Sometimes I pretend she's my mom. I think she misses someone too." The cab rolled through the light snow. Edward blinked fast, gripping the wheel tighter. Sophia leaned her forehead against the window, watching children toss snowballs outside a toy shop. "You know what I wish?" she said softly. "I wish my dad would stop working just one day. Grace says Christmas isn't about money, it's about showing up. But he's always busy showing up for everyone else." Her voice wavered slightly, small and steady, like a violin string stretched too thin. Edward's throat burned. He wanted to tell her, "I'm here now," but the disguise kept him silent. They stopped at a red light near a park decorated with angels and wreaths. A group of families posed for photos, laughter spilling into the cold air. Sophia smiled faintly. "Grace promised we'd go see the Christmas lights tonight. She said maybe Dad will come too, but I don't think he will." "Why not?" Edward asked carefully. "Because promises don't mean much when people forget how to keep them." The words struck deep. The cab moved on, each turn peeling away layers of his defenses. Finally, when they reached home, Sophia handed him a crumpled dollar from her pocket. "Keep the change, mister, and Merry Christmas." He froze at the small phrase. So casual, so pure. Before he could respond, she was already running toward the mansion gates, her small boots crunching in the snow. Grace waited at the door, waving. She looked at the cab, recognition flickering in her eyes. She knew. She always knew. Later that evening, when Edward returned the cab to the garage, Grace met him with a quiet smile. "How was your first shift, Mr. Blake?" He sighed, sinking into the nearest chair. "My daughter thinks she has two fathers, one real, one imaginary. The imaginary one always shows up." Grace's eyes softened. "Then maybe it's time the real one does too." Outside, the first notes of Silent Night drifted from the nearby church. Snow began to fall heavier now, blanketing the city in forgiveness. Edward looked out the window, the reflection of the Christmas tree shimmering across his tired face. For the first time in years, he felt something thawing inside him, something warmer than wealth, quieter than guilt. And in that fragile moment, he understood. Redemption had come disguised not in miracles yet, but in the simple courage to start over. The following morning, Manhattan glittered beneath a sheet of snow, the kind that made everything look clean, as if the city itself had been forgiven overnight. Inside the Blake mansion, though, tension hummed like a quiet storm. Grace was pouring cocoa into 2 mugs when the front door burst open. Mrs. Caldwell, Edward's icy personal assistant, strode in with a tablet in hand and panic on her face. "Sir, you need to see this. It's everywhere." Edward looked up, still in his casual jacket, far from his usual suit. "What is?" She turned the screen toward him. On it, a tabloid headline screamed, "Millionaire in disguise. Edward Blake spotted driving a yellow cab near Midtown Elementary." The photo showed him, cap tilted low, profile half hidden, but unmistakable. Next to him, Sophia's tiny figure was visible in the back seat. Grace gasped softly, hand over her heart. "Oh no." Mrs. Caldwell's lips tightened. "The press is speculating you've lost your mind. Investors are calling for statements. Do you realize what this could do to the company's image?" Edward's jaw clenched. His instinct was to handle it as a crisis, a problem to fix, not a story to feel. But before he could respond, Sophia appeared on the staircase, holding her stuffed rabbit. Her voice trembled. "Dad, why were you pretending to be someone else?" He froze. Grace stepped forward, but Edward lifted a hand, silently asking her to stay back. "Sophia, Her chin quivered. "Was it all a joke? Were you spying on me?" "No, sweetheart, I just wanted to—" She turned and ran before he could finish, the rabbit falling from her grasp. It landed at Grace's feet, one ear bent, one button eye missing. Grace crouched, picking it up gently. "She's scared, sir," she said quietly. Children don't always understand reasons. They feel the fear before the truth. Edward pressed his palms to his temples. "I just wanted to listen to her, the way you told me to." "That was brave," Grace said softly. "But sometimes bravery looks strange to the world." By evening, the story had gone viral. Headlines mocked him. "The billionaire cab driver." Talk shows debated his sanity. Some called it an elaborate publicity stunt. Others claimed he'd snapped under pressure. That night, Edward found Sophia hiding in the music room, her eyes red. Grace sat beside her, reading softly from a Christmas storybook, the one she always brought out in December. When Edward entered, Grace rose to leave, but Sophia whispered, "Stay." He hesitated. "Sophia, can we talk?" She looked up. "Everyone at school saw the picture. They said you did it because you were bored. Or crazy." Edward knelt beside her. "I did it because I missed you. I didn't know how else to reach you." Sophia's voice cracked. "Then why did you lie?" "Because honesty was something he'd forgotten how to give." He opened his mouth, but the truth tangled with pride. "I didn't want to scare you. I wanted to see what you really thought of me." She stared, confusion swirling with pain. "So you tricked me?" Grace's hand brushed the child's shoulder. "He didn't mean harm, honey. He just wanted to see your heart." Sophia turned away, her small shoulders shaking. "You didn't have to dress up to hear me, Dad. You just had to be here." The words shattered him more than any scandal ever could. Later that night, as the snow thickened outside, Grace found Edward sitting alone in the study. Lights dimmed. He stared at the fireplace, its glow dancing against his weary face. "You can't fix this with press statements," she said gently. "This isn't a stock that needs recovering. It's a child who needs you." "I know," he murmured. "But I've spent so long being the man who fixes things, I forgot how to simply stay broken." Grace stepped closer, her tone warm but firm. "Maybe it's time you let Christmas break you open. That's how light gets in." He looked up at her, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "How do you always know what to say?" "Because I've been where you are," she said. "When my son died, I thought God had taken everything. But then I realized he left me one thing still worth giving: love. It doesn't run out, Mr. Blake. You just stopped pouring yours." Her voice cracked at the end, and she quickly turned away, embarrassed by the tremor. Edward stood slowly. "Grace." But before he could finish, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Caldwell entered again, her tone clipped. "Reporters are outside the gate, and—" She hesitated. "Child services called. Someone filed a complaint that Sophia might be under stress due to her father's erratic behavior." Grace's eyes widened. "Oh, Lord." Edward's breath caught. "Who would do that?" Mrs. Caldwell sighed. "Someone at the school, I assume. They said the girl seemed frightened." Frightened because of him. Within an hour, flashing cameras lined the street. Paparazzi shouted questions through the snow. Grace pulled the curtain shut, whispering prayers under her breath. Edward stood by the window, his reflection fractured by the glass. Sophia peeked from the hallway, trembling. "Are they here to take me away?" He knelt down. "No, baby. No one's taking you anywhere." Grace joined them, wrapping Sophia in her arms. The three of them huddled in the soft light of the Christmas tree, its ornaments shimmering like fragile hopes. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Inside, the mansion that once echoed with silence now held a different sound. Edward's steady, shaking voice whispering, "I won't lose you too." Grace looked at him over Sophia's shoulder, eyes steady. "Then fight the right way this time, Mr. Blake. Not with lawyers, with love." And for the first time, Edward nodded, not as a CEO, not as a man protecting an image, but as a father desperate for redemption. The next day dawned under a heavy sky, gray and trembling with snow. The Blake mansion stood still, a fortress of silence. News vans idled outside the gates, cameras pointed like rifles. Inside, the air carried the weight of sleeplessness. Grace moved through the house quietly, her presence steady amid the chaos, her soft humming of "O Holy Night," the only sound holding the morning together. Sophia sat at the kitchen table, hugging her stuffed rabbit, its ear barely hanging on by a thread. She hadn't spoken since the night before. Edward stood a few steps away, watching helplessly, his once confident hands unsure of what to do with themselves. "Mr. Blake," Grace said gently, sliding a cup of tea toward him. "You need to breathe before you can be the father she needs." He ran a hand through his hair, his voice a whisper. "They think I'm unstable. They want to send someone to evaluate the environment." Grace's eyes softened. "Then let them see the truth." But truth was a fragile thing, especially when buried under years of guilt. That afternoon, as the snow thickened, 2 social workers arrived. Their polite professionalism cut through the air like cold wind. Sophia clung to Grace's side while Edward answered question after question in the living room. His voice wavered when he tried to explain the taxi incident, how it wasn't madness, but desperation. One of the agents, a woman with kind eyes, finally said, "Mr. Blake, your daughter's emotional health is our concern. She's mentioned you're distant." Edward's throat tightened. "She's right. I've been absent, but I'm trying to make that right. Please, don't punish her for my mistakes." When they left, Grace found him staring out at the frozen garden. "You can't fight shame with silence," she said softly. "You need to show them who you really are." That night, the city trembled under a blizzard. The wind howled against the windows, rattling ornaments on the tree. Sophia had gone to bed early, her small body curled up under a quilt Grace had made years ago. Edward sat by the fire, exhausted. Grace entered quietly, holding a framed photo. Clara holding baby Sophia on her first Christmas. "She had your eyes," Grace whispered, "and your stubbornness." Edward managed a weak smile. Clara believed in miracles. I stopped believing after she died. "Maybe you stopped too soon," Grace said. "Miracles don't always look like angels. Sometimes they look like second chances." Before Edward could respond, a small sound pierced the air. Sophia's coughing, sharp and deep. Grace rushed upstairs, Edward on her heels. When they reached the room, Sophia was sitting up, flushed and wheezing. "Her fever's high," Grace said quickly, placing a trembling hand on the child's forehead. "She needs a doctor now." Edward grabbed his phone, dialing frantically, but the storm had cut the lines. Roads were closing across the city. "The hospital's 10 miles away," he said, panic rising. Grace didn't hesitate. "Then we drive. You still have that cab, don't you?" Minutes later, the two of them wrapped Sophia in blankets and carried her to the yellow taxi waiting in the garage. Snow hammered the windshield as Edward turned the key. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. The streets were nearly empty, just emergency lights flickering through the storm. Grace sat in the back, cradling Sophia, whispering prayers and gospel hymns under her breath. "Hold on, baby. Just hold on." Edward's knuckles were white on the wheel. Every skid of the tires echoed his heartbeat. "Left up ahead," Grace called over the wind. "The bridge might still be open." But when they reached it, barricades blocked the way. Edward slammed the brakes, chest heaving. "We can't make it through," Sophia whimpered weakly. Grace met his eyes through the rearview mirror. "Then pray, sir." Not like a businessman, like a father. For the first time in years, he did. His voice broke, raw and unguarded. "God, please, don't take her. Not her too." He turned the car toward the nearest church, the steeple light faint through the storm. When they arrived, Edward carried Sophia inside, stumbling down the aisle. Candles flickered around the nativity scene, their soft glow wrapping the moment in something almost holy. Father Daniels, the old parish priest, hurried over. "Bring her here." He laid a hand on Sophia's forehead and whispered a prayer. Grace knelt beside him, her hands clasped tight. Minutes felt like hours. The child's breathing steadied little by little. When her eyelids fluttered open, she whispered one word. "Daddy." Edward broke. Tears streamed down his face as he held her close. Grace smiled through her own tears, whispering, "Christmas miracle." Sophia turned her head slightly, looking at Grace. "Mommy Grace, I saw Mommy Clara in the light. She said you take care of me now." Grace covered her mouth, sobbing softly. "Oh, sweetheart." Edward looked at both of them, his world tilting into clarity. In that church, under the glow of the nativity candles, every wall he had built finally fell. He turned to Grace. "I thought I hired you to care for my daughter. I never realized you were sent to save us both." Grace shook her head, voice trembling. "I just loved what you almost lost." Sophia smiled faintly. "Can we go home now, Daddy?" He kissed her forehead. "Yes, baby, home." When they returned to the mansion, dawn had broken, the storm fading into a pale, forgiving sky. Reporters were gone, the world still. Grace tucked Sophia into bed, humming softly until her breathing evened out. Edward stood in the doorway, watching the two people who had taught him what love really meant. Later, as the first sunlight touched the snow, he walked into the living room. The fireplace glowed, the Christmas tree shimmered. On the mantel sat the photo of Clara, and beside it, the rabbit Sophia had carried since infancy, now repaired, its ear sewn back neatly. Grace entered quietly behind him. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. He smiled, tired but peaceful. No, I didn't want to miss a moment. Outside, church bells rang across the city, announcing Christmas morning. Inside, Edward Blake, once a man defined by wealth, finally understood what true fortune meant. It wasn't the mansion, the empire, or the name carved on skyscrapers. It was the laughter drifting down the hall, the warmth of two hands that had pulled him from the edge. And for the first time in decades, Edward whispered a prayer of gratitude. Thank you for sending her. Both of them. Morning sunlight streamed through the wide glass windows of the Blake mansion, soft and golden after the long, brutal storm. Outside, snow blanketed the city like a fresh start. Inside, for the first time in years, warmth didn't come from the marble fireplace. It came from laughter. Sophia sat cross-legged near the Christmas tree, the twinkling lights reflected in her bright eyes. Wrapping paper lay everywhere. Grace knelt beside her, helping untie ribbons, while Edward watched from the couch, coffee in hand, a quiet smile replacing the tension that used to live on his face. "This one's from you, Daddy?" Sophia asked, holding a small silver box with crooked tape. Edward chuckled. "Yes, I wrapped it myself, and clearly I need more practice." Grace laughed softly. "Let's just say it's not your core skill, sir." Sophia tore the paper open and gasped. Inside lay a delicate golden locket. She opened it, finding two photos, one of her mother, Clara, holding her as a baby, and one of Grace, smiling beside last night's Christmas tree. On the back was engraved, "Family, the miracle that never fades." Sophia's eyes shimmered. "It's perfect," she whispered, throwing her arms around her father's neck. "Thank you, Daddy." Edward hugged her tightly, the scent of cocoa and pine filling his chest with a kind of peace he hadn't known since Clara's death. "You don't have to thank me, sweetheart. I should have been here all along." Grace turned away discreetly, blinking back tears. For years, she had prayed this home would feel alive again. Watching them now, she felt that prayer answered. Later that morning, they bundled up and walked through Central Park. The snow crunched under their boots as carolers sang Silent Night in the distance. Edward held Sophia's hand on one side and Grace's on the other. Passers-by recognized him, the billionaire from the headlines, but no one saw scandal now. Only a father, a daughter, and the woman who'd helped him rediscover his soul. They stopped in front of St. Mark's Church. The bells chimed noon. Edward looked up at the steeple and smiled faintly. "I used to drive past this place every day and never notice it." Grace's voice was gentle. "Sometimes God waits until we slow down enough to see him." Inside, candles flickered along the pews. They knelt together. Sophia whispered her prayer, small but sure. "Thank you for Mommy Clara, for Mommy Grace, and for my daddy who came back." Edward's eyes filled. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm not leaving again, Sophia. I promise." Grace smiled through quiet tears. That's the only gift she ever wanted. When they returned home, the house felt lighter. Edward insisted Grace stay for Christmas dinner, not as staff, but as family. He even set the table himself. The meal was simple: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, hot cider. But it was more joyous than any gala he'd ever attended. Sophia lifted her cup of cocoa. "Can we make a rule? Every Christmas, no work, no phones, just us." Edward raised his glass. "Deal. From now on, that's Blake family law." Grace clinked her cup against his. "To family, born and found." Laughter filled the room. Outside, snow fell again, soft as forgiveness. Later that night, after Sophia drifted to sleep, Edward found Grace standing by the window, gazing at the lights of the city. "You should rest," he said. "You've given this house more peace than it's ever known." Grace turned to him, her eyes warm. "You gave it to yourself, Edward. You just needed a reason." He hesitated. "If I could change one thing, I'd have met you sooner." She smiled gently. Some miracles come late, but right on time. For a long moment, they stood side by side, watching snowflakes drift past the glass. Down the hall, Sophia murmured softly in her sleep, clutching her repaired rabbit, its ear sewn back by Grace's careful hands. Above the fireplace hung 3 stockings, one for Sophia, one for Edward, and a new one stitched in red thread. Grace. Edward looked at it and smiled. Merry Christmas, Grace. Merry Christmas, Edward, she replied. The clock struck midnight, and the bells outside began to ring, clear, steady, full of promise. For the first time in years, the Blake mansion didn't echo with loneliness. It sang with laughter, forgiveness, and the quiet miracle of a family reborn. Because that Christmas, love had finally come home.